The film opens in the middle of a tense rescue mission, as a highly skilled group of mercenaries known as the Expendables launches an assault along the Somali coast in the Gulf of Aden. Their target is straightforward but dangerous. Free, a group of hostages who have been held by pirates for an extended period. At the front of the operation is Barney Ross, a battle-hardened former SAS soldier, leading a tight-knit crew that includes the dependable Lee Christmas, the agile and quick-striking Yin Yang, the unpredictable sharpshooter Gunnar Jensen, the steady Blade, and the imposing Hail Caesar. The situation quickly escalates when the pirate leader prepares to execute one of the captives. Out of nowhere, multiple red laser dots appear across his chest, halting him instantly. His crew reacts by raising their weapons, searching for the unseen threat. Barney steps forward with controlled confidence, attempting to calm the situation before it spirals. He tosses a duffel bag packed with $3 million onto the ground, proposing a clean exchange for the hostages. But the pirate leader, driven by greed, pushes for more, demanding an additional $2 million. Barney keeps his composure, trying to reason with him, urging him to take the deal and walk away. But the pirate refuses to budge, and the tension begins to boil over. Gunnar, already on edge, loses his patience. Despite Barney's efforts to keep things under control, Gunnar suddenly opens fire, taking out the pirate leader and instantly igniting a full-scale firefight. Everything descends into chaos. Smoke grenades are deployed, blanketing the area in thick clouds as the team switches to night vision goggles. They rappel down with precision, moving swiftly to secure the hostages. For a moment, it looks like they have the upper hand. But then, a pirate manages to activate a generator, flooding the area with light and stripping away their tactical advantage. Even with the situation shifting, Barney gives the remaining pirates one final chance to surrender. They refuse, and that decision proves fatal. Barney responds with calculated force, neutralizing the remaining threats and bringing the operation under control. Just when it seems like the mission is successfully wrapped up, things take an unsettling turn. Gunnar, clearly not in a stable state of mind, grabs a captured pirate and threatens to execute him in a brutal manner. Barney steps in, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Gunnar doesn't respond. Yin Yang attempts to intervene physically, confronting him head-on, but the tension escalates even further. With no other option, Barney raises his weapon and orders Gunnar to stand down. After a tense moment, Gunnar reluctantly backs off. That incident makes one thing painfully clear. Gunnar has become a liability. Despite their shared history, Barney makes the difficult decision to cut him loose from the team. Later that night, Lee is dealing with troubles of his own. He discovers that his girlfriend, Lacey, has moved on, leaving him emotionally shaken and distracted. Meanwhile, Barney meets up with Tool, the team's resourceful middleman and weapons expert. As Tool works on finishing Barney's back tattoo, Lee joins them, and for a brief moment, the tension eases. They engage in a casual game of darts, but unexpectedly, Lee loses, a rare slip that hints something isn't quite right with him. Elsewhere, on the remote island of Vilhena, a much darker scene unfolds. A military vehicle arrives at a massive palace, transporting prisoners accused of betrayal. Inside a dimly lit corridor, General Garza confronts them, accusing them of stealing from the nation. The prisoners insist they're innocent, but Garza remains cold and unmoved. Before he can act, a sharply dressed man steps forward, James Monroe. Without hesitation, Monroe pulls the trigger, killing one of the prisoners. He then pressures Garza to finish the job, insisting that showing strength is necessary to maintain control. Though clearly conflicted, Garza ultimately gives in and carries out the execution. Back on Barney's side, he meets with a mysterious figure known only as Mr. Church. During the meeting, he also crosses paths with Trench, a rival mercenary with a complicated past. Church presents them with a risky assignment: remove General Garza from power on Vilhena Island, located in the Gulf of Mexico. Trench, sensing the danger, declines the job and subtly pushes it toward Barney instead. Barney negotiates carefully, setting the price at $5 million up front, with the rest secured offshore. Church agrees, but makes it clear that failure is not an option. Returning to their base, Barney begins studying maps and gathering intelligence on Vilhena. Not long after, Gunnar shows up again, asking for another chance to prove himself. He insists he's still capable, but Barney doesn't budge, pointing out his unstable behavior and ongoing issues. Frustrated, Gunnar storms off, throwing out a vague warning that Barney chooses to ignore. That same night, Barney assembles the team and briefs them on the mission. Soon after, they approach Valina's coastline under the cover of darkness. Barney and Lee pilot their aircraft toward a port, using forged documents and a fabricated story about transporting injured wildlife to slip past security unnoticed. What they don't realize is that Gunner has secretly boarded the plane before takeoff, hiding himself without alerting anyone. Once on the island, Barney and Lee move cautiously, keeping a low profile as armed patrols roam the area, signaling that they've stepped into a tightly controlled and dangerous environment. Keeping a low profile, Lee quietly begins documenting what's happening around them, capturing footage of soldiers mistreating civilians, gathering proof of the regime's cruelty. Not long after, they connect with Sandra, Church's contact on the island, at a nearby bar. She takes them on a drive through Valina, painting a picture of what the island used to be, peaceful, thriving, before it fell under General Garza's iron grip. She also hints that an American figure played a major role in its downfall. Despite losing her parents and watching her home deteriorate, she still clings to the belief that things can change. Curious and cautious, Barney asks her to take them closer to the palace. Sandra hesitates for a moment but eventually agrees. They stop near the massive structure, and Lee steps out first, scanning the area and taking everything in. Barney and Sandra follow shortly after. But something feels off. Barney's instincts start ringing alarm bells. He turns to Sandra, questioning her directly, suspecting she may have led them into a setup. Sandra stands her ground, insisting she's only trying to help her people. Barney doesn't fully buy it, warning her that the situation on the island might be beyond saving. Before the tension can settle, the sound of an approaching military truck cuts through the moment. A group of Garza's soldiers arrives, instantly turning the situation volatile. One of them, aggressive and clearly used to throwing his weight around, grabs Sandra and coldly reminds her that even being the general's daughter won't protect her if she steps out of line. He begins dragging her toward the truck. That's when Lee moves. Without hesitation, he steps in, creating just enough distraction for Barney to act. In a matter of seconds, Barney begins taking down the surrounding soldiers with precise, controlled shots. At the same time, Lee shifts into full combat mode, showing just how dangerous he really is. His movements are sharp and efficient as he drops one attacker after another. The soldier holding Sandra becomes his next target, while Barney handles the remaining threats, his shots flying dangerously close to Lee, who shoots him a quick, irritated glance. With no time to spare, they rush back to their vehicle and speed away. But the incident doesn't go unnoticed. News of the confrontation near the palace quickly reaches Monroe and his men. Meanwhile, Barney and Lee make it back to the port. Barney immediately takes charge, instructing Lee to get Sandra onto the plane and keep her safe while he stays behind to deal with Monroe's forces. Lee agrees and guides Sandra toward the aircraft, opening the door for her. But she doesn't move. Sandra refuses to leave. No matter how much Lee tries to convince her, she stands firm. This is her home, and she won't abandon it. Her decision is unwavering. Realizing there's no changing her mind, Lee reluctantly backs off and heads toward the cockpit. At that exact moment, Garza's soldiers arrive, raising their weapons toward the plane. Before they can act, Barney intervenes, taking them out with swift precision. Meanwhile, Sandra slips back into her truck just as Monroe speeds past her, completely focused on stopping Barney from escaping. Inside the aircraft, Lee begins maneuvering it away from the dock with perfect timing. On the ground, Barney sprints toward the moving plane, racing against a hail of incoming fire. As bullets tear through the air behind him, he launches himself off the edge of the port, catching hold of the aircraft mid-motion. Hanging on for a split second, he pulls himself inside. Once he's aboard, Lee informs him that Sandra chose to stay behind. It wasn't part of the plan, but Barney doesn't dwell on it. Instead, he makes a quick decision. Taking control, he turns the aircraft back toward the port. As they circle back, Lee prepares for another attack. The moment they're in position, he opens fire from the aircraft, unleashing a relentless stream toward Monroe's forces. Right behind him, Barney pours fuel down onto the area below. The coordination is flawless. Before Monroe's men can react, Lee ignites it. A massive blast erupts, consuming the port in flames. Monroe and a handful of his closest men barely manage to escape by diving into the water, but many of the others aren't as lucky, getting caught in the explosion. Later that night, tensions flare inside the palace. Monroe confronts Garza, furious over what happened. His main concern isn't just the attack, it's Sandra. Garza's own daughter helped the outsiders. Despite the heavy losses, Monroe is focused on loyalty above all else. He warns Garza that even his daughter won't be spared if she continues to interfere. As Garza leaves, an unexpected figure arrives, Gunner. A deal is struck quickly. For $100,000, Gunner agrees to join Monroe's side. Elsewhere, Barney begins to piece together the truth about their employer. Mr. Church isn't just some mysterious client, he has ties to the CIA. This mission was never only about removing a dictator. Their real target is James Monroe himself, a former CIA operative. Digging deeper, Barney realizes Monroe partnered with Garza out of pure greed, taking control of the island's drug operations. To keep that control, Monroe rules through fear, making sure no one dares to challenge their authority. Barney gathers Lee and Yang and lays out everything he's uncovered. After going over the risks and what the mission has truly become, they come to a hard conclusion. They're walking away. It's no longer worth the cost. But as the night drags on, Barney can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. The decision sits heavy on him. Unable to ignore it, he goes to find Toole. There's something unsettled in his expression. Sandra's determination, her refusal to abandon her people, keeps replaying in his mind. It's not just another mission anymore. Sensing this, Toole doesn't give him a direct answer. Instead, he shares a story something from his past during the Bosnian War. He talks about a woman he once had the chance to save, and didn't. That moment, he admits, never left him. It became something he carries with him every day. Not just regret, but a reminder of who he chose to be in that moment. The meaning lands without needing to be spelled out. The choices you make stay with you. At the same time, things take a darker turn on Valena. Sandra is captured by Monroe's men and brought in for questioning. They press her for answers, why the Americans came, what their objective was. Before she can say anything, Garza steps in. His tone is harsh, but there's a clear conflict beneath it. Still, Sandra doesn't hold back. She confronts him directly, accusing him of destroying his own country and betraying his people. Her words cut deep, but she doesn't stop there. She tells him that if he's already gone this far, he might as well finish it and end her life too. Monroe's men step in, trying to break her resolve through pressure and intimidation. But Sandra refuses to give them anything. When it becomes clear she won't crack, they change tactics, keeping her alive as leverage instead. By morning, Barney has made his decision. He's going back. He's bringing Sandra out. Lee isn't on board. The plan sparks a heated argument between them, with Lee questioning the risks and whether it's even worth it. But Barney doesn't budge. For him, this isn't just a job anymore, it's personal. Yang steps in without hesitation, siding with Barney. Even when Barney initially pushes back, Yang insists on coming along. During their journey, Yang opens up in a rare moment of honesty. He admits he's tired. Constantly facing opponents bigger and stronger than him has taken its toll. Being the smallest on the team often means he absorbs the worst of the impact, and sometimes he wonders if it's all worth it. But despite everything, he's still here, still willing to fight. Their mission takes an unexpected turn when they're stopped at a checkpoint. Waiting for them is Gunner. Now aligned with Monroe, he stands with a group of armed men blocking their path. The tension snaps almost instantly. What begins as a standoff erupts into chaos. Fortunately, Barney and Yang are inside a reinforced vehicle, giving them just enough protection as bullets slam against the exterior. Within moments, it turns into a high-speed chase. Barney takes control behind the wheel, pushing the vehicle through sharp turns and obstacles, staying just ahead of their pursuers. Beside him, Yang leans out, returning fire with deadly accuracy. His focus locked on Gunner in the middle of the chaos. The pursuit drives them toward an abandoned warehouse where everything comes to a sudden stop. Inside, the conflict becomes personal. Yang faces Gunner again. This time, he uses the environment to his advantage. The low ceiling of the warehouse works against Gunner, forcing him into awkward movements as he repeatedly bumps into it during the fight. For a brief moment, Yang gains control, landing precise, well-timed strikes, but it doesn't last. Gunner regains the upper hand, overpowering Yang and lifting him off the ground. Just as the situation begins to spiral, Barney steps in and fires. The shot hits Gunner near the chest, dropping him instantly, but not killing him. Barely holding on, struggling for breath, Gunnar clings to consciousness as Barney kneels beside him, demanding answers. Who's behind this? Who sent him? With the last of his strength, Gunnar pulls Barney closer and whispers something into his ear. After the encounter, Barney and Yang make their way back to the aircraft. The rest of the Expendables are already there, Lee included. They may not fully agree with Barney's decision, but loyalty runs deeper than disagreement. No matter what, they stand together. Without wasting time, the team takes off once again, heading straight back to Valina. During the flight, Barney shares what he learned. Before collapsing, Gunnar revealed something critical: the layout of Garza's palace, a full blueprint. Now, with that knowledge in hand, the team prepares for a final, decisive move. Back on the island, the situation between Garza and Monroe reaches a breaking point. Garza confronts him directly, accusing Monroe of going too far, of bringing in outsiders to eliminate him when things started slipping, and worse, of using Sandra as leverage. Furious, Garza demands that Monroe release his daughter immediately or face the consequences. Before Garza and Monroe's confrontation can go any further, the Expendables strike. They move in with precision, slipping into the palace like shadows. Lee, Yang, Caesar, and Toole split up, each heading toward designated points. Explosives are planted methodically throughout the structure. Key locations, supply areas, and critical parts of the operation are all marked for destruction. Elsewhere, Sandra refuses to sit and wait. Even restrained, she fights back against two of Monroe's men, resisting with everything she has. The struggle intensifies until the door suddenly bursts open. Barney storms in. Armed with Gunnar's blade, he moves fast, taking down both men with ruthless efficiency. He immediately cuts Sandra free, steadying her as he prepares to get her out of there. But they don't make it far. They're intercepted. Monroe's elite enforcers close in, surrounding them and sealing every possible exit. The situation turns brutal. In the chaos, Sandra is dragged away again, while Barney is overwhelmed. One of the soldiers locks him in a chokehold, cutting off his air, while Monroe's right-hand man steps in, delivering blow after blow, demanding to know how many operatives Barney has inside the palace. Barney doesn't give them anything. He holds his ground. Just when it seems like he's about to be taken out, everything changes. The rest of the Expendables arrive. Yang and Lee move together with perfect coordination, taking down one of Monroe's top enforcers in a seamless attack. Barney breaks free, turning the fight around with raw strength and close-quarter skill. And then Caesar steps forward. Armed and unstoppable, he unleashes overwhelming firepower, tearing through the room and forcing the remaining enemies to retreat. The tide shifts instantly. The team regroups and pushes forward, forcing their way to the palace gates, only to find themselves facing an entire army of Garza's soldiers waiting outside. With no clear way through, they fall back. Garza steps forward, taking control of the moment. Instead of ordering an attack, he turns to his own men. In a powerful admission, he acknowledges the damage he's caused, admitting his past mistakes, and declaring that Valina should be free from outside influence. It feels like a turning point, but it's cut short. Without warning, Monroe fires, silencing Garza before he can finish. Then, without hesitation, he escapes, taking Sandra with him and retreating toward a waiting helicopter. Garza's death sends everything into chaos. His soldiers open fire on the Expendables, unleashing a relentless barrage. In the middle of it all, the team urges Barney to detonate the explosives, but he refuses. Not yet. Not until Sandra is safe. Every second stretches. Then Lee confirms it. She's clear. Barney presses the detonator. The palace erupts. Flames and debris tear through the structure, collapsing it from within and scattering the attacking forces. The momentum shifts instantly. From the wreckage, the Expendables push forward, launching their final assault. One by one, the remaining soldiers are overwhelmed. But Barney isn't done. His focus locks onto Monroe. He moves ahead, closing the distance for one last confrontation. Nearby, Toole and Lee work together, taking down Monroe's right-hand man in a fiery clash. At the same time, Barney and Caesar unleash heavy firepower, destroying the helicopter and cutting off Monroe's only escape route. Now cornered, Monroe makes his last move. He grabs Sandra, pulling her in front of him as a shield. Trying to stall, he speaks to Barney, claiming they're the same men who operate without emotion, driven only by the job. But Barney doesn't buy it. This was never about him. It was about her. Without hesitation, Barney fires, striking Monroe multiple times. And before Monroe can recover, Lee steps in, driving his blade forward, ending it for good. As dawn breaks over Valina, the chaos finally settles. Barney takes the payment they received for the mission and hands it over to Sandra, trusting her to rebuild the island and restore what was lost. With everything finished, the team says their goodbyes and heads home. Back at Tool's place, the atmosphere shifts completely. The tension fades, replaced by a sense of relief and quiet celebration. The team gathers, reflecting on everything they've been through together. Then, unexpectedly, Gunnar shows up. Alive, recovering, different. This time, he's ready to make things right. Later, in a calmer moment, Lee shares a heartfelt piece dedicated to Tool. And to bring it all full circle, he follows it up with a flawless knife throw landing dead center, exactly where it needs to be. There's something instantly compelling about the idea behind the Expendables. Before you even press play, before a single frame unfolds, before a single burst of cinematic chaos lights up the screen, the concept alone already does half the work. Because this isn't just a movie, it's a reunion, a collision of eras, a moment that feels designed entirely for people who grew up watching action cinema at its peak, when heroes didn't just appear, they commanded the screen. And at the center of that idea is Sylvester Stallone, not just starring, but essentially curating an entire legacy. There's a sense that he isn't simply assembling a cast, he's assembling a timeline, a living archive of action cinema, compressed into a single frame where every face carries decades of cultural impact. This isn't about introducing something new, it's about bringing something back. And not quietly, boldly, confidently, on a grand cinematic scale. And there's a kind of self-awareness in that approach, a recognition that sometimes the most powerful thing a film can do isn't evolve a genre, but remind audiences why they fell in love with it in the first place. Think about what this film is really doing. It takes the icons, the faces that define decades of action, and puts them all in one place. Jason Statham, Jet Li, Dolph Lundgren, each one representing a different flavor of action cinema, a different legacy, a different era of dominance. And what's fascinating is how the film doesn't attempt to blur those identities. It preserves them. It treats each persona almost like a brand, allowing the audience to instantly connect with what each actor brings without needing exposition or reinvention. And instead of reshaping them, it leans into everything you already recognize about them. This is not a film interested in subtlety. It's not trying to reshape the genre. It's not trying to modernize these characters. It's doing something much simpler, and in many ways, much smarter. It's celebrating them. And in doing so, it creates a kind of cinematic shorthand, where recognition replaces explanation, and presence replaces complexity. Because what made 80s action films special wasn't complexity, it was presence. It was the confidence of heroes who didn't need long backstories or layered motivations to command attention. They walked into a scene, and you already knew who they were. There's a mythic quality to that kind of storytelling, where characters function less like individuals and more like symbols of strength, resilience, and control. That's exactly the energy the Expendables taps into. It's built on recognition, on memory, on the idea that seeing these figures share the same screen is, in itself, the experience. And that experience isn't just visual, it's emotional. It taps into nostalgia, not as a background element, but as the core engine driving audience engagement. It reminds you of a time when action cinema was unapologetically larger than life, when realism took a backseat to spectacle, and when the thrill came from watching seemingly unstoppable figures navigate high-stakes situations with absolute certainty. And then, there's the moment that perfectly captures what this film is all about. A brief scene, almost throwaway in terms of runtime, but culturally, it lands with undeniable impact. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, and Sylvester Stallone standing together, not in separate franchises, not across different decades, together. And what makes that moment resonate isn't just the visual of them sharing the frame, it's the weight of everything they represent individually, now converging into a single cinematic space. It's history folding in on itself. It's decades of action cinema suddenly becoming tangible in a way that feels almost surreal. It's not about what they do in that scene, it's about what they represent. For fans of that era, that moment alone justifies the entire concept. It's the kind of moment that transcends narrative function and becomes purely experiential, something you feel rather than analyze. But here's the thing, that nostalgia, it's both the film's greatest strength and its biggest safety net. Because once you strip everything else away, the plot, the structure, the execution, what you're left with is a film that knows exactly what it's offering. Not innovation, not depth, not reinvention, but a feeling, a return. A reminder of what action movies used to feel like when they were bigger, louder, simpler, and unapologetically over the top. And there's a certain comfort in that familiarity. A predictability that isn't necessarily a flaw, but a feature. The film isn't trying to surprise you, it's trying to satisfy you, to deliver exactly what you expect in the most direct and unfiltered way possible. And whether that works for you depends entirely on what you came for. If you're looking for something fresh, you won't find it here. But if you're looking for that old-school adrenaline, that nostalgic rush, that sense of watching legends do exactly what made them legends in the first place, then The Expendables doesn't just understand that expectation, it's built entirely around it. It functions almost like a time capsule, preserving a style of filmmaking that has largely been replaced and presenting it without apology or compromise. And in a landscape where action films often lean heavily into digital spectacle or hyper-stylized realism, there's something oddly refreshing about a film that chooses to embrace simplicity as its core identity. Before The Expendables even reached audiences, it had already succeeded. Not because of its story, not because of its execution, but because of what it promised. This wasn't marketed like a regular action movie. This was positioned as an event. A once-in-a-generation crossover, a lineup so stacked it almost felt unreal. You had Sylvester Stallone leading the charge. Then came Jason Statham, Jet Li, Dolph Lundgren, each name adding weight, adding credibility, adding anticipation. And beyond just listing names, the marketing leaned heavily into the mythology of these actors, their histories, their reputations, the collective memory attached to them. It wasn't just about who they were now. It was about who they had been to audiences for decades. And then the marketing did something very deliberate. It didn't just present a movie, it presented a moment. Trailers, posters, TV spots, everything pushed one idea. What if all your action heroes were in the same film? And just like that, expectations surged. Because audiences weren't just going in to watch a story, they were going in to witness history. There's a psychological shift that happens when a film is framed this way. It stops being evaluated purely on narrative terms and starts being experienced as a cultural event, something you feel compelled to be part of, regardless of its actual content. But here's where things get interesting. Because the marketing didn't just build excitement, it built very specific expectations. It painted a picture of scale, of interaction, of legendary figures sharing meaningful screen time in a way that felt substantial. Take the cameos, for example. The presence of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis wasn't just hinted at, it was emphasized, highlighted in a way that made it feel like they were core parts of the film. But in reality, their roles are brief, almost symbolic, and that creates a gap between what was presented and what was actually delivered. And that gap isn't necessarily about quality, it's about perception, about the difference between anticipation and reality. That's the risk of positioning something as an event. Because when you promise something this big, this iconic, this once-in-a-lifetime, people expect more than just appearances. They expect impact, they expect scale. They expect something that feels as expansive as the idea itself. They expect interactions that go beyond novelty moments, that feel earned, expanded, and fully realized within the narrative. And when those expectations aren't completely met, it doesn't erase what the film does achieve, but it does reshape how that achievement is experienced. And to be fair, The Expendables does deliver on a certain level. You see the stars, you get the large-scale action, you feel the nostalgia. There's an undeniable energy in watching these performers occupy the same space, even if that space isn't always used to its fullest potential. But at the same time, there's this lingering sense that the film never fully capitalizes on its own build-up, that it gives you the ingredients, but not the complete experience those ingredients could have created. It sets the table perfectly, but doesn't quite serve the meal you imagined when you first saw the menu. Because when you gather this many legends in one place, the expectation isn't just a good action movie. It's the action movie, the kind that redefines the genre, the kind that feels unforgettable, the kind that doesn't just celebrate history but becomes a part of it. And that's where The Expendables finds itself in an interesting position, caught between what it represents and what it ultimately delivers. And that's where the pressure really begins to take shape. In the end, The Expendables exists in that space between promise and payoff. It delivers enough to satisfy the core idea, but it also reminds you consistently of what it could have been if it had pushed just a little further. Because the anticipation didn't just promote a film, it promoted a vision, a larger-than-life spectacle that felt almost limitless in its potential. And while the movie comes close, it never fully becomes as expansive as the moment that was built around it. There's a subtle ceiling you can feel, a point where the film seems content to meet expectations rather than exceed them. And that's where the tension lies, not in what the film fails to do, but in how clearly you can see what it could have done with just a bit more ambition, a bit more expansion, a bit more willingness to go beyond the surface of its own concept. There's a point where a movie stops being about characters and starts being about presence. That's exactly where The Expendables lives. Because let's be honest, this film isn't built around a traditional ensemble, it's built around icons. You've got Sylvester Stallone anchoring the entire experience as Barney Ross. Then right beside him, Jason Statham bringing speed, charisma, and a natural screen rhythm that often feels like the film's real heartbeat. And around them, a lineup that doesn't just fill space, it defines the identity of the film. Jet Li with precision, Dolph Lundgren with raw, unpredictable energy, Terry Crews with pure, high-impact force. Each one stepping into the kind of role you instantly recognize because you've seen them own it before. And what's interesting is how the film uses that familiarity almost like a shortcut, skipping the need for traditional character building and instead relying on decades of audience association to do the heavy lifting. And that's the key. This film doesn't try to reinvent these actors. It leans into what they already are. Their personas, their history, their legacy. You don't need long introductions. You don't need deep backstories. The moment they appear, you already know what they bring to the table. There's a kind of efficiency in that approach, where time isn't spent explaining who these people are, but rather showcasing them in motion. The film trusts that the audience already carries the context, already understands the shorthand, already recognizes the archetype. And in a fast-paced, action-driven narrative, that kind of trust allows the film to move quickly without losing clarity. Now, when it comes to chemistry, that's where the film quietly succeeds. There's a natural ease between the cast, especially between Sylvester Stallone and Jason Statham. Their dynamic feels relaxed, almost effortless, like two professionals who understand exactly how to play off each other without forcing it. There's a rhythm in their exchanges, a back and forth that feels lived in rather than constructed. Even in smaller interactions, there's a sense that these actors are enjoying the moment, that they're aware of the scale, but also the significance of what they're doing, and that awareness creates a tone that balances intensity with a subtle sense of playfulness. It keeps the film from becoming overly heavy, allowing moments of levity to emerge naturally from the interactions rather than feeling inserted. And that energy translates. It creates a kind of cohesion that holds the film together, even when the narrative itself starts to thin out. Because when the plot isn't driving the engagement, the personalities are. The way these characters occupy the same space, the way they react to each other, the way their distinct styles contrast and complement, it all adds a layer of entertainment that exists beyond the script itself. You're not just watching a mission unfold, you're watching personas collide. But here's the reality. When you bring together this many big names, balance becomes difficult. Because no matter how you structure it, someone is going to feel underused. Some characters get full arcs. Some get standout moments. And some barely get anything at all. And it's not just about screen time, it's about narrative significance, about who gets to matter within the story and who becomes more of a background presence. You see flashes of potential moments where certain characters could have had more depth, more impact. But the film simply doesn't have the space to explore everyone equally. And that imbalance becomes more noticeable precisely because of how recognizable these actors are. You don't just see a character being underused. You see an entire legacy not being fully utilized. And in a strange way, that's both understandable and frustrating. Understandable because the film has to maintain focus, has to prioritize momentum, has to avoid becoming overcrowded with competing arcs. But frustrating because the very thing that makes the film exciting, its stacked cast, is also what limits how much it can do with each individual. It's a trade-off, depth for scale, focus for variety, and depending on what you value more as a viewer, that trade-off will either feel justified or disappointing. The film tries to address this by focusing primarily on two central figures, Sylvester Stallone and Jason Statham. And honestly, that was the right decision. Because without that focus, the film risks becoming scattered, overloaded, directionless. Anchoring the narrative around a central dynamic gives the story something to hold on to, a through line that keeps everything from drifting apart. But even with that structure, you can't ignore the feeling that this cast deserved more, that within this lineup, there were opportunities for richer interactions, more layered dynamics, more meaningful exchanges that could have elevated the ensemble beyond just presence. There's also another layer to this, because this isn't just about how the characters interact. It's about how the audience reacts to seeing them together, that moment of recognition, that moment of nostalgia, that moment where you realize this lineup actually exists. There's a kind of disbelief that turns into excitement, a realization that what once felt impossible is now unfolding right in front of you. Even the brief appearances from Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger carry more weight than their screen time suggests. They don't need extended scenes. Their presence alone is enough to elevate the moment, because they arrive with decades of meaning already attached to them. And the film understands that, using their appearances not for narrative expansion, but for emotional impact. And that's ultimately what defines the ensemble in The Expendables. It's not about equal screen time. It's not about perfectly balanced storytelling. It's about impact. About placing legends in the same frame and letting that image do the work. It's about the spectacle of recognition, the thrill of familiarity, the satisfaction of seeing icons coexist within the same cinematic space. Because at the end of the day, you don't watch this film for character depth. You watch it to see what happens when decades of action cinema stand side by side. When you look at The Expendables, one thing becomes immediately clear. These aren't characters in the traditional sense, they're archetypes. Each member of the team walks in already fully formed, not because of what the script builds, but because of what the audience already knows. And that creates a very specific kind of storytelling environment. One where development is replaced by reinforcement, where characters don't grow so much as they reaffirm who they've always been. Sylvester Stallone isn't just Barney Ross. He's the hardened leader, the quiet decision-maker, the man carrying the weight of every mission. There's a stoicism in his performance, a controlled intensity that suggests experience, fatigue, and responsibility without needing to articulate it explicitly. Jason Statham isn't just Lee Christmas, he's precision, attitude, sharp humor, and refined skill wrapped into one. He brings a kinetic energy that contrasts Stallone's grounded presence, creating a dynamic that feels both balanced and complementary. Jet Li represents speed and discipline. Dolph Lundgren brings instability and unpredictability. Terry Crews embodies raw power, pure, high-impact force. Each one functions almost like a specific tool within the team, defined by what they do rather than who they are beneath the surface. You don't need exposition, you don't need development. The moment they appear, you understand them. And that's both the film's strength and its limitation. Because while these archetypes make the film instantly accessible, they also prevent it from going deeper. Most of these characters don't evolve, they don't transform, they simply exist within the roles they've always played. And while that consistency reinforces the nostalgic appeal, it also creates a certain predictability in how the characters operate within the story. Now, to be fair, some stand out more than others. Jason Statham, in particular, brings a level of energy and personality that cuts through the chaos. He doesn't just occupy his role, he elevates it. There's a sharpness to his performance, a sense of timing and presence that makes even smaller moments feel impactful. Whether it's through his physicality, his delivery, or the subtle confidence he carries in every scene, he becomes a focal point. Not because the film tells you to focus on him, but because he naturally draws that attention. His presence feels natural, engaging, and at times, even grounding. There's a steadiness to the way he moves through scenes, a kind of controlled confidence that makes the intensity around him feel more anchored. He doesn't overplay the role, doesn't force energy where it isn't needed. Instead, he brings a sense of ease that contrasts nicely with the heavier, more rigid presence surrounding him, and that balance becomes important. Because in a film filled with larger-than-life personas, having someone who feels fluid and reactive adds a layer of accessibility to the experience. Dolph Lundgren is another surprise. His character carries a hint of internal conflict, just enough to feel slightly more layered than the rest. There's an unpredictability to him that isn't just physical, but psychological. You sense that he's not entirely stable, not entirely aligned, and that tension gives his presence a different kind of weight. He's not just another member of the team, he's a variable, and even though the film doesn't fully explore that instability, it's there in the performance, subtly influencing how you read his actions and his place within the group dynamic. And then, there's Mickey Rourke's role, which briefly touches something more reflective, offering a glimpse of depth the film never fully commits to. In a movie driven by movement and momentum, his presence slows things down just enough to introduce introspection. There's a tonal shift in those moments, a pause that hints at regret, at history, at the emotional cost of a life built on high-stakes conflict. It's almost like the film momentarily steps outside of its own identity to acknowledge something more human, more grounded. And while it doesn't stay there for long, that brief detour adds texture, suggesting that beneath all the surface-level spectacle, there's a deeper story that simply isn't the film's priority. But for every standout, there are others who fade into the background. That's the unavoidable reality of a film like this. When you assemble this many recognizable figures, you create expectation, not just that they'll appear, but that they'll matter. And here, not everyone does. Some characters get moments, some get action highlights. Some get a single defining trait and nothing beyond that. And because the film moves so quickly, there's little room for those characters to expand beyond their initial impression. They arrive, they contribute, and then they recede, functionally important but not narratively significant. And that imbalance becomes more noticeable precisely because of how recognizable these actors are. You don't just see a character being underused, you see an entire legacy not being fully utilized. Even more interesting, the film doesn't actually treat its main character as traditionally as you'd expect. Sylvester Stallone's Barney Ross is central, yes. But in terms of engagement, he often feels more reserved, more internal. There's a deliberate restraint in how he's written and performed. He doesn't dominate scenes through volume or constant activity. Instead, he operates with a quiet authority, allowing others to occupy the foreground while he remains the steady center holding everything together. Meanwhile, Jason Statham's character frequently carries the momentum in a way that feels more immediately dynamic. He's quicker, sharper, more outwardly expressive, and that naturally draws attention. So the film makes a choice. Instead of trying and failing to balance everyone equally, it narrows its focus. It builds around a few key players and lets the rest orbit around them. And structurally, that's the right call. Because without that focus, the entire film risks becoming scattered, overloaded, directionless. Too many competing arcs, too many personalities competing for space, it would dilute the impact rather than enhance it. By creating a hierarchy within the ensemble, the film maintains clarity, even if it sacrifices inclusivity in the process. But that doesn't completely resolve the issue. Because as a viewer, you can't help but notice what's missing. The potential that's there, but never fully explored. The characters who could have been more, but weren't given the space. There's an underlying sense that within this lineup, there were opportunities for richer dynamics, more layered interactions, more moments that could have elevated the ensemble beyond its functional role. And it's that awareness, that sense of unrealized potential, that lingers. And that's what defines The Expendables on a character level. It's not about deep writing, it's not about layered arcs, it's about recognition. About stepping into a world where every face already carries history and watching those histories collide, briefly, intensely, and sometimes unevenly. Because in a film built on legends, not everyone gets to shine at the same time. Let's be honest for a second. If you walk into The Expendables expecting a deeply layered story, you're already watching the wrong movie. Because this film doesn't just keep things simple, it embraces simplicity. There's a kind of confidence in that decision, a refusal to overcomplicate something that's designed to be immediate and immersive. At its core, the setup is as straightforward as it gets. A team of elite mercenaries is hired for a mission. A dictator on a remote island needs to be taken down. There's money on the table, there's risk waiting on the ground, and that's it. That's the engine that drives everything forward. Led by Sylvester Stallone as Barney Ross, the team takes on what initially feels like just another assignment, another job in a long line of high-pressure operations. And the way the film presents this setup reinforces that routine. There's no sense of novelty for the characters. They've done this before, they'll do it again. But once they arrive, things shift. The mission becomes more complicated. The situation isn't what it seemed, and suddenly, it's not just about completing the job, it's about understanding who's really pulling the strings. That shift introduces just enough intrigue to keep the narrative from feeling completely mechanical. Now, on paper, that sounds like the beginning of something deeper. A conspiracy. A moral dilemma. A turning point for the characters. The kind of narrative pivot that could reshape motivations and challenge loyalties. But in execution, The Expendables doesn't linger on any of it. It presents these elements, acknowledges them, and then moves forward without fully unpacking their implications. Because The Expendables isn't interested in building complexity, it's interested in momentum. Every story beat exists for one purpose, to move the characters from one high-stakes sequence to the next. There's a hint of emotional stakes, Barney's connection to a local woman, the idea of leaving someone behind, the question of whether this is just another job or something more. And those elements do add a layer of direction, a sense that there's something at risk beyond the mission itself. But those elements never fully take control of the narrative. They're there, just enough to give the story shape, not enough to redefine it. They function more like anchors than engines, keeping the story grounded without driving it into deeper territory. And that's a conscious choice, because with a cast this large and a focus this heavy on action, a complex narrative could easily slow everything down. It could fracture the pacing, dilute the intensity, and shift attention away from what the film is fundamentally trying to deliver. So instead, the film strips the story to its essentials. Clear objective, clear opposition, clear path forward. It removes anything that might interrupt the flow, anything that might demand prolonged reflection. In many ways, it mirrors the action films it's inspired by. Those classic 80s setups where the plot wasn't the attraction, it was the excuse. An excuse for confrontation, an excuse for spectacle, an excuse for large-scale cinematic intensity. And that simplicity creates a kind of rhythm, predictable but effective. You always know where you are, you always know what's coming next, and that clarity allows the film to move with confidence, even if it sacrifices surprise along the way. And that approach works, to a point. Because while simplicity keeps the film moving, it also limits how much it can engage beyond the surface. You always know where things are going, you rarely feel surprised, and the stakes never become truly unpredictable. There's no sense of narrative risk, no moment where the story feels like it might take an unexpected turn. But maybe that's not the goal. Maybe the goal isn't to challenge you. Maybe it's to deliver exactly what it promises, nothing more, nothing less. Because in The Expendables, the story isn't the destination. It's just the road that gets you to the action. It's the connective tissue, not the core experience. And once you accept that, the film becomes easier to engage with on its own terms. Beneath all the large-scale set pieces, beneath the rapid-fire confrontations, beneath the non-stop intensity, The Expendables quietly asks a different question. What happens when men who live for missions are forced to confront meaning? It's not a question the film explores in depth, but it's one that lingers beneath the surface, influencing certain choices, certain moments, certain pauses in the action. At the center of that question is Sylvester Stallone as Barney Ross. On the surface, he's exactly what you expect, a leader, a professional, someone who completes the job and moves on, no hesitation, no attachment, no second thoughts. But there's a subtle undercurrent to his performance, a sense that this routine, this cycle of missions and detachment, isn't as effortless as it appears. That somewhere beneath the control and discipline, there's a question waiting to be acknowledged. But this time, something changes. When the mission takes him to the island, and he comes face to face with someone who refuses to leave, someone who chooses to stay and stand their ground. Barney is forced into a position he's not used to. It disrupts his usual detachment. Up until this point, decisions have been procedural, almost mechanical. Assess the risk, complete the job, move on. But here, that pattern fractures. Because what he encounters isn't just resistance, it's conviction. And conviction has a way of lingering in a way that orders and contracts never do. He walks away. He leaves. And for the first time, that decision doesn't sit right. There's a tension that follows him out of that moment, something unresolved that doesn't fade once the immediate danger is gone. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's internal. a quiet discomfort that grows the longer he tries to ignore it. Because this isn't just about completing a contract anymore, it's about conscience. And conscience, unlike a mission, doesn't have a clear endpoint. It doesn't resolve itself once the objective is technically complete. There's a moment quiet, almost understated, where the film slows down just enough to let that idea surface. A conversation, a reflection, a memory of what happens when you choose not to act. And what makes that moment effective is how restrained it is. The film doesn't underline it, doesn't push it to the forefront, it simply allows it to exist. And in doing so, it creates a brief window where the character is no longer defined by action, but by hesitation, by doubt, by the realization that sometimes doing nothing carries its own consequences. And suddenly, beneath the hardened exterior, you see the weight, not just of the mission, but of everything that's come before it. The accumulation of choices, of moments where detachment was easier than involvement. That's where the theme of redemption begins to take shape. Not in a dramatic, over-explained way, but in a simple decision to go back. And what makes that decision resonate isn't the scale of the action that follows. It's the shift in motivation that drives it. Barney doesn't return because he has to. He returns because he chooses to. Because for once, the mission isn't about money, it's about doing something that actually matters. And that distinction, however subtle, reframes everything. It transforms the mission from an assignment into a statement, small, contained, but significant within the context of who this character has been up until now. And that choice doesn't just affect him, it defines the team. Because loyalty in the Expendables isn't spoken, it's shown. These aren't characters who deliver long speeches about brotherhood. They prove it through action, through showing up, through standing together, through following a leader into a situation where the odds don't favor them. And what's compelling about that dynamic is how unspoken it is. There's no need for explanation, no need for justification. The bond exists because it's been built over time, implied through behavior rather than articulated through dialogue. That's the unspoken rule of this world. You don't question the mission. You don't abandon your team. And when one of your own makes a decision, you back it, no matter what. There's a code operating beneath the surface, one that values loyalty above logic, unity above individual hesitation. And even when the stakes shift, even when the motivation changes, that code remains intact. Even characters who seem unstable, unpredictable, disconnected, they're still bound by that same code. A shared understanding that whatever their pasts may be, this team is what they have now. And that sense of belonging, however loosely defined, becomes a kind of anchor. It gives purpose to characters who otherwise exist in a constant state of movement, shifting from mission to mission without pause. But here's the thing. The film never fully dives into these themes. It touches them. It hints at them. It sets them up, and then pulls back. Because every time the story starts to slow down, the action takes over again. And that interruption creates a pattern where emotional depth is introduced, but never fully developed. It's present, but fleeting. So what you're left with is something interesting. Not a fully developed emotional arc, but a framework. A glimpse of something deeper beneath the surface. Enough to suggest that there's more going on internally than the film chooses to explore externally. And maybe that's intentional. Because The Expendables isn't trying to become a character-driven drama. It's trying to stay true to its identity, fast, direct, and driven by momentum. But in those brief moments, those pauses between the chaos, you can see what the film could have been. A story not just about mercenaries, but about men trying to prove to themselves that they're more than just the missions they're paid to complete. That beneath the routine, beneath the repetition, there's still the capacity for choice, for change, for something that isn't dictated by orders or contracts. And in the end, that single decision to go back, to do the right thing, becomes the closest thing this film has to redemption. Not loud, not complex, but just enough to remind you that even in a world built on action, there's still room for conscience. On the surface, The Expendables looks like pure, unapologetic action. High-intensity combat, large-scale explosions, relentless missions, non-stop chaos. But if you look just a little closer, there's something else sitting underneath it all. Something quieter, something the film never fully commits to, but never completely ignores either. It's there in the structure, in the setup, in the way the conflict is framed. Because the mission itself isn't random. A group of mercenaries is sent to remove a dictator on a small island, Simple, right? But then the layers start to reveal themselves. The dictator isn't really the one in control. There are outside forces, hidden agendas, powerful figures operating behind the scenes, manipulating events, shaping outcomes, deciding who rises and who falls. And that shift reframes the conflict. What initially appears to be a localized problem begins to feel like part of a larger system. And suddenly, the film isn't just about taking down a target, it's about who's really pulling the strings. That's where the political undercurrent begins. Not as a fully developed statement, but as a suggestion. You start to see hints of something larger, influence beyond borders, power being exercised from a distance, conflicts that aren't as isolated as they appear. And the film introduces these ideas just enough to give the narrative a sense of scale beyond the immediate action. The island becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a symbol, a place where control is imposed, where authority is unstable, where the people caught in the middle don't really get a say. It represents a kind of contained environment where larger forces can operate without scrutiny, where outcomes are dictated from afar. And for a brief moment, that symbolism feels like it might evolve into something more substantial. And for a moment, it feels like the film might explore that. But it doesn't go all the way. Because every time the story edges toward something deeper, toward commentary, toward reflection, it pulls back. It chooses action over analysis, momentum over meaning. The political elements remain in the background. They shape the mission, but they don't define the narrative. They provide context, but not consequence. Even the idea of intervention, of outsiders stepping in to fix a situation, is presented more as a plot device than a moral question. There's no real debate, no lasting consequence, just a task that needs to be completed. And that simplicity aligns with the film's overall approach. Clear objectives, clear outcomes, minimal complication. And that's where the film makes its choice clear. The Expendables isn't trying to be a political film. It's borrowing political elements to give it story weight, but not to challenge the audience. It uses those ideas as a backdrop, not as a focal point, and in doing so, it maintains its pace, its clarity, its identity. So what you're left with is something interesting. A story that hints at global influence, hidden power, and complex dynamics, but ultimately simplifies all of it into a clear objective: identify the target, neutralize the threat, move on. And maybe that's the point, because in a film built around action, complexity can become a distraction. Still, those hints are there, and they raise a question the film never fully answers. In a world where power operates behind the scenes, are the heroes really changing anything, or are they simply playing their part in a much bigger system? It's a question that lingers quietly beneath the spectacle. And what makes it interesting is that the film never dismisses it outright. It simply refuses to engage with it directly. It lets the idea exist in the background, almost like a shadow that follows the narrative without ever stepping into the spotlight. Even if the film itself never pauses long enough to explore it, that underlying ambiguity adds a subtle layer of tension, one that contrasts with the otherwise straightforward nature of the story. There's a very specific kind of mindset behind The Expendables, and it starts with Sylvester Stallone, not just as the lead, but as the director shaping everything you see. Because this film doesn't feel like it's trying to keep up with modern action cinema. It feels like it's pushing back against it. There's an almost defiant quality to its construction, as if it's consciously rejecting the polished, hyper-stylized trends that have come to define contemporary action films. Stallone isn't here to reinvent the genre. He's here to reclaim it, to reassert a version of action that prioritizes physicality over spectacality, impact over illusion. And you can feel that in the way the film is built. This is old-school action at its core: heavy weaponry, practical explosions, physical combat, real impact. There's a deliberate emphasis on tactile action, on making things feel solid, grounded, almost intense in their execution. When something erupts on screen, it doesn't just flash, it hits. You feel the force behind it. There's weight, there's debris, there's consequence. And that physicality creates a sense of immersion that's often missing from more digitally driven sequences. That philosophy comes straight from the era that made Sylvester Stallone a legend. The kind of filmmaking where action wasn't clean or stylized, it was loud, messy, and overwhelming. Where the camera didn't just observe the action, it was placed right in the middle of it. And The Expendables leans into that identity without hesitation. It embraces imperfection, embraces excess, embraces the idea that action should feel chaotic rather than controlled. But here's where things get complicated. Because while the intention is clearly rooted in that old-school approach, the execution doesn't always stay there. At times, the film feels caught between two styles, almost like it's trying to honor the past while still acknowledging the present, and not always finding the perfect balance between the two. On one side, you have that classic, practical, boots-on-the-ground action. Sequences where the choreography is visible, where the geography of the scene is clear, where every movement has purpose and direction. On the other, you have modern techniques, rapid cuts, shaky camera movement, fragmented editing, techniques designed to amplify intensity, but which can also obscure it, and instead of blending seamlessly, those styles sometimes clash. There are moments where the action feels powerful and controlled, where you can see the choreography, feel the weight, understand every movement, where each impact lands with clarity and intention. And then there are moments where everything becomes a blur, where the camera moves too much, where the cuts come too fast, where the clarity disappears, and the action becomes more about sensation than comprehension. It's a strange contradiction. A film that wants to celebrate old-school action but occasionally presents it through a modern, chaotic lens. And that inconsistency affects how the action is experienced. Because when clarity is lost, so is impact. When you can't fully see what's happening, you can't fully feel it. Still, when Sylvester Stallone leans fully into his strengths, the film finds its rhythm. Large-scale explosions feel real. Set pieces feel ambitious. There's a sense that things are actually happening, not just being simulated, and that authenticity carries weight. It grounds the spectacle in something tangible, something you can connect to on a physical level rather than just a visual one. Because in an era where action can sometimes feel overly polished or artificial, there's something refreshing about a film that isn't afraid to be rough around the edges. That embraces imperfection as part of its identity, that prioritizes impact over precision, even if that comes at the cost of refinement. But that same roughness can also become a problem, because without restraint, without precision, intensity turns into overload. And when everything is pushed to its maximum, there's no room left for escalation. No space for contrast, no opportunity for the action to build in a way that feels dynamic rather than constant. And that's where Sylvester Stallone's direction becomes a balancing act. Between honoring the past and adapting to the present, between delivering impact and maintaining clarity, between giving the audience everything and knowing when to hold something back. In the end, The Expendables reflects Stallone's philosophy perfectly. It's not about elegance. It's not about subtlety. It's about force, about pushing action to its limits, even if that means crossing the line between thrilling and overwhelming. Because for Stallone, action isn't something you carefully construct, it's something you unleash. If there's one thing The Expendables never holds back on, it's action. From the very first sequence, the film makes its intention clear. This isn't about build-up. This isn't about restraint. This is about impact. It throws you directly into the chaos, skipping the slow escalation in favor of immediate intensity. High-intensity combat erupts, explosions tear through the screen, characters are launched through space, chaos takes over. And it doesn't stop. The action here isn't subtle, it's relentless. Scene after scene, the film pushes forward with large-scale confrontations, close-quarters combat, aerial sequences, and expansive destruction. It's built like a constant surge of energy, rarely slowing down long enough to let the dust settle. And that pacing creates a very specific experience, one that prioritizes momentum over modulation. And when it works big. There are moments where everything comes together perfectly. A mid-film sequence involving an aerial assault stands out, not just for its scale, but for how it blends movement, coordination, and precision into something genuinely memorable. The interplay between characters, the balance between offense and defense, the sense of control within the chaos. It all aligns in a way that feels deliberate and impactful. Then there's the final act, a full-scale confrontation that stretches on, escalating with wave after wave of action. It's designed to feel overwhelming, to push the audience into a state of sensory saturation, and in terms of sheer intensity, it succeeds. It delivers exactly what it promises: scale, noise, and continuous escalation. But that's also where the film starts to show its limits. because there's a fine line between intensity and exhaustion, and The Expendables crosses that line more than once. When action never stops, it stops feeling special. Without variation, without contrast, the peaks begin to flatten. Everything starts to feel like the same level of intensity, and as a result, individual moments lose their distinction. Instead of building toward peaks, the film stays at maximum volume the entire time, and without moments to breathe, those quieter pauses that allow tension to reset, the impact starts to fade. What begins as exciting gradually becomes repetitive. Not because the action itself is poorly executed, but because it lacks the structural variation needed to keep it consistently engaging. Then there's the choreography. On one hand, you can see the intention clearly. Each actor is given space to showcase what they do best, and that's where the individuality of the cast starts to shape the action itself. Each style, each movement, each approach reflecting the persona behind it. Jet Li brings speed and technical precision. Jason Statham delivers fluid, aggressive combat with sharp weapon-based techniques. Steve Austin adds raw physical power in direct confrontations. You can feel the individuality in how they move, how they engage, how they respond within each sequence. Each style is distinct, almost like a signature, something that sets them apart even within the chaos of group action. There's a rhythm to their movements that reflects who they are as performers, and when the camera allows it, those differences become one of the film's strongest assets. But that individuality isn't always captured clearly, because the way the action is filmed, quick cuts, shaky movement, rapid transitions, sometimes makes it difficult to fully appreciate the choreography. There are moments where you can tell something precise and carefully constructed is happening, but the presentation obscures it. Instead of highlighting the skill, the editing compresses it. Instead of showcasing the flow, the camera fragments it. And, as a result, sequences that should feel clean and impactful end up feeling more chaotic than they need to be. Moments that should feel precise end up feeling scattered. And that distinction matters. Because in action cinema, clarity isn't just about seeing what's happening, it's about feeling it, understanding the space, the movement, the cause and effect of each action. When that clarity is lost, even well-designed choreography can lose its impact, reduced to flashes of motion rather than fully realized sequences. And then there's the intensity of the action. This is where the film fully commits. The sequences are exaggerated, stylized, and often pushed to extremes. It leans into excess, into spectacle, into a kind of over-the-top energy that feels almost larger than life at times. There's no attempt to soften it, no effort to hold back. Instead, the film amplifies everything, turning every confrontation into something bigger, louder, more forceful than it realistically needs to be. Explosions are larger, impacts feel heavier, everything is heightened, and that amplification becomes part of the film's identity. It's not trying to mirror reality, it's trying to heighten it, to push every moment just beyond the edge of believability into a space where action becomes spectacle rather than simulation. For some viewers, that's exactly the appeal. The excess, the intensity, the sheer scale of everything unfolding. It creates a kind of adrenaline-driven experience that feels unapologetically bold. But for others, it can feel like too much. Because when high-intensity conflict becomes constant, when large-scale destruction becomes routine, it starts to lose its weight. What should feel impactful becomes expected. What should feel surprising becomes standard. Still, there's no denying what The Expendables is trying to do. It's not aiming for realism. It's not aiming for restraint. It's aiming for scale, for presence, for a kind of sensory overload that prioritizes experience over nuance. And in that sense, The Expendables delivers exactly what it promises. A film where action isn't just part of the experience, it is the experience. The question is, do you want to be energized by it or overwhelmed by it? For a film built on larger-than-life personalities, you'd expect The Expendables to be packed with sharp humor, unforgettable one-liners, and constant self-aware moments. Because that's part of the legacy it's drawing from. Those classic action films weren't just about intensity, they were about attitude, about lines that stayed with you long after the scene ended. And to be fair, those elements are there, just not as much as you'd expect. They appear in flashes rather than as a consistent tone, surfacing in moments that hint at what the film could have leaned into more fully. Because hidden beneath all the action, there's a tone the film occasionally taps into. Self-parody, a quiet acknowledgement of what it is and what these actors represent. And when that tone surfaces, it adds a different kind of energy, one that feels lighter, more playful, more aware of its own identity. The clearest example? That now iconic scene. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, all in one frame. It's not just a cameo, it's a moment built entirely for the audience, a recognition of history, of rivalry, of legacy, all condensed into a single interaction. The dialogue leans into their history, their rivalry, even their real-world identities. There's a playful edge, a sense that the film is briefly stepping outside itself to say, yeah, we know exactly what this is, and for a few minutes, it works perfectly. It creates a sense of shared understanding between the film and the audience, a moment where the spectacle becomes self-aware without losing its impact. It's fun. It's self-aware. It's exactly the kind of moment fans came for. But here's the thing. That level of humor, that level of awareness, doesn't carry throughout the film. It feels isolated rather than integrated, like a tone the film visits briefly but doesn't commit to as part of its overall identity. Outside of a few exchanges, especially between Jason Statham and Sylvester Stallone, the humor feels surprisingly limited. There are attempts at one-liners, moments of banter, small bursts of personality, but very few lines that actually stay with you, very few that feel crafted to be remembered. And that's where the film feels like it's holding back. Because with a cast like this, comedy should feel effortless. These are performers known not just for action, but for presence, charisma, and timing. They have the ability to elevate even simple lines into something memorable. Yet instead of fully embracing that, the film often leans too heavily into seriousness. Even the self-parody, which could have been a defining tone, is used sparingly. It shows up, reminds you what the film could be, and then disappears again, and that inconsistency creates a tonal imbalance. Because when the film does lean into humor, it works. It adds dimension, it creates contrast, it gives the audience a moment to reset before diving back into the intensity. Then there's the fan service. And this is where The Expendables absolutely knows what it's doing. Every casting choice, every entrance, every interaction, it's all designed to trigger recognition, to activate memory, to create those moments where the audience connects instantly with what they're seeing, to give the audience those moments where they lean forward and think, wait, is that? And most of the time, that works. Because seeing these legends share the screen, even briefly, carries its own kind of impact. It taps into something beyond the film itself. It taps into years of familiarity, of association, of cultural memory. It doesn't always need depth, it just needs presence. But again, there's that feeling of missed potential, because the film gives you just enough to enjoy, but not enough to fully satisfy. It delivers recognition, but not always interaction. It delivers appearances, but not always substance. The cameos are memorable, but short. The humor is present, but inconsistent. The self-awareness is clever, but underused. And in a film like this, those elements could have elevated everything. They could have added texture, balance, and a sense of play that complements the intensity rather than competing with it. Because when action becomes overwhelming, humor becomes essential. It gives the audience space. It balances the tone. It makes the experience more dynamic. Without it, the film risks feeling heavier than it should, more intense than engaging. In the end, The Expendables delivers fan service. It delivers moments. It delivers glimpses of something more playful, more self-aware, more fun. But it never fully commits to that side of itself. And that's what makes this aspect of the film so interesting, because you can see exactly what it could have been if it had just leaned a little harder into the joke. There's a moment in almost every action movie where the dialogue hits, a line lands, a comeback sticks, a single sentence becomes iconic, something that defines the character or even the film itself. The Expendables rarely has that moment, and that's surprising, because with a cast like this, with personalities this strong, you expect the dialogue to carry weight. You expect lines that feel sharp, memorable, effortless, lines that feel like they belong to these actors, that reflect their presence and amplify it. Instead, you get something very different. The writing here feels built from familiar pieces, lines you've heard before, exchanges that follow predictable rhythms, moments that feel like they exist because the genre expects them to. There's a sense of familiarity that borders on repetition, Not in a literal sense, but in tone, in structure, in delivery. And that's the key word, expected. Because this film doesn't just use action movie cliches, it leans into them. The tough talk, the overly serious tone, the exaggerated back and forth that sounds intense but doesn't always feel natural. At times, it feels like the dialogue is trying to sound powerful instead of actually being powerful. And when the film attempts something deeper, that's where the cracks really start to show. There are moments, especially in more reflective scenes, where the writing reaches for emotion. Monologues, confessions, internal struggles, but instead of landing with impact, they feel forced, awkward, almost disconnected from the rest of the film. It's like the script briefly tries to become something more serious without fully knowing how to get there. Then there's the humor. We talked about how the film has the potential for great one-liners. But the problem isn't just that they're limited, it's that many of them simply don't stay with you. They come and go without leaving an impression, and that matters. Because in a film this heavy on action, dialogue isn't just filler. It's what gives the action personality. It's what makes moments memorable. Without strong lines, even big scenes can feel less impactful. Now, to be fair, some of this is intentional. This is a film rooted in the 80s action formula, and that formula has always relied on simplicity. Straightforward dialogue, clear intentions, no unnecessary complexity. But here's the difference. The best films from that era didn't just use cliches, they elevated them. They made them feel fresh. They made them feel iconic. The Expendables often just repeats them. And because of that, the dialogue never quite rises to the level of the cast. You have actors capable of delivering unforgettable lines, working with material that rarely gives them the opportunity. And that creates a disconnect. Because while the film succeeds in bringing these legends together, it doesn't always give them the words to match their presence. In the end, the writing does its job. It moves the story forward. It fills the gaps between action sequences, but it rarely does more than that. And in a film built on legacy, that feels like a missed opportunity. Because sometimes, all it takes is one great line to make everything else unforgettable. This film just doesn't quite find it. There's a rhythm to great action movies. Build, release, breathe, then hit harder the next time. The Expendables doesn't really follow that rhythm. From the moment it starts, the film pushes forward with urgency. Missions begin quickly. Conflicts escalate fast. Action arrives early and keeps coming. At first, that energy works. You feel the momentum. You feel the intensity. You feel like the film isn't wasting your time. But here's the problem. When everything is loud, nothing feels louder. Because The Expendables doesn't build toward its biggest moments. It stays at maximum intensity for most of its runtime. And without those natural rises and falls, the structure starts to flatten. The first half of the film actually shows glimpses of balance. There are character interactions, small moments of humor, brief pauses that let the story settle. But as the film moves forward, that balance disappears. By the time you reach the final stretch, it turns into a non-stop barrage. Explosions, high-intensity combat, relentless confrontations, more explosions, and it just keeps going. What should feel like a climactic payoff starts to feel like excess. Because when action goes on for too long, without variation, without restraint, it stops building excitement and starts creating fatigue. You're no longer anticipating the next moment, you're just watching it happen. Then there's the structure itself. The story moves in a straight line. Mission, complication, return, final assault. It's clear, it's simple, it's efficient, but it's also predictable. There are very few surprises in how the film unfolds. Very few moments where the pacing shifts in unexpected ways, and that predictability adds to the problem. Because when you already know where things are going, the journey needs to carry you. The pacing needs to elevate the experience. Here, it doesn't always. Another key issue is how the action is presented. Rapid cuts, quick transitions. Scenes that move so fast, they barely register before the next one begins. Instead of building tension, the film often rushes through it. Moments that could have been impactful don't have time to land, and over time, that creates a strange effect. The film feels both fast and exhausting. It moves quickly, but feels longer than it is. Because without pauses, without contrast, the experience becomes overwhelming. And that's the core issue. The Expendables confuses more action with better pacing. But pacing isn't about how much you show. It's about when you show it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing an action movie can do is slow down. Action can only hit as strongly as the way it's presented. You can have the biggest explosions, the strongest cast, the most ambitious set pieces, but if the execution isn't right, the impact disappears. And this is where The Expendables becomes complicated. Because visually, the film has two very different identities. On one side, there's the intent. You can see it in the large-scale setups, the practical explosions, the heavy use of real environments. There are moments where the film looks gritty, grounded, even atmospheric, muted colors, deep shadows, flashes of light cutting through the darkness. At its best, it feels raw. But then, there's the execution. Let's start with the cinematography. At times, the image feels inconsistent. Grainy textures, shots that drift slightly out of focus, lighting that makes certain scenes, especially at night, hard to follow. And in an action film, clarity is everything. Because if you can't clearly see what's happening, you can't feel it. Then comes the editing. This is where things really start to break down. The film relies heavily on rapid cuts, shots that last barely a second, sequences that jump from angle to angle before you can fully process what you're seeing. Instead of building flow, it creates fragmentation. Action becomes a series of flashes. Moments that should feel connected start to feel disconnected, and that leads directly into one of the biggest issues, the use of shaky camera. Now, this technique can work. When used carefully, it adds intensity, urgency, a sense of realism. But here, it's overused. The camera moves constantly. It shakes. It shifts. It refuses to settle. And instead of enhancing the action, it obscures it. You don't feel like you're inside the moment. You feel like you're trying to keep up with it. Then there's the CGI. Interestingly, the film tries to rely more on practical effects, and when it does, it works. Explosions feel physical. Impacts feel heavy. But whenever CGI steps in, the illusion weakens. Certain effects, especially digital enhancements tied to impacts and destruction, stand out in the worst way. They look artificial, disconnected from the environment, almost unfinished. And in a film that's aiming for gritty realism, that contrast becomes even more noticeable. What makes this all more frustrating is that the foundation is there. You can see moments of strong visual thinking, creative framing, layered compositions, even subtle stylistic choices that hint at something more refined. But those moments get lost in the chaos, because instead of letting the visuals breathe, the film overwhelms them. In the end, The Expendables isn't lacking ambition, it's lacking control. It wants to feel intense. It wants to feel raw. It wants to feel immersive. But sometimes, the way it's presented makes it feel the opposite. Because in action filmmaking, it's not just about what you show, it's about how clearly you let the audience experience it. And here, that clarity is often the first thing to disappear. Every great action movie needs one thing to truly work: a villain that feels dangerous, not just present, not just opposing, but genuinely threatening. Because no matter how strong your heroes are, if the opposition doesn't feel real, the stakes disappear. In The Expendables, the antagonists are there, clearly defined, easy to identify, positioned to be taken down. At the center of it all is Eric Roberts. He plays the kind of antagonist you instantly recognize. Calm on the surface, calculating underneath, operating with a sense of control that suggests he's always one step ahead. And to his credit, he leans into that role. There's a theatrical edge to his performance, a confidence, a presence that makes him easy to engage with and easy to root against. Alongside him, you've got Steve Austin, bringing a completely different kind of threat. Where Roberts is calculated, Austin is physical. He represents the direct confrontation, the kind of opponent who doesn't say much, but makes his presence known the moment the encounter begins. And in those one-on-one moments, he works. But here's where the problem starts. Despite having the pieces in place, the antagonists never quite rise to the level they need to. They don't feel overwhelming. They don't feel unstoppable. And most importantly, they don't feel like they can actually win. From the moment they're introduced, you understand their role. They're not there to truly challenge the heroes. They're there to be overcome by them. And that changes everything. Because tension comes from uncertainty, from the feeling that things could go wrong, that the heroes might not succeed. Here, that feeling rarely exists. Even when the stakes are high, even when the action escalates, there's always a sense of control. a sense that the outcome is already decided. The antagonists don't dominate the story, they don't shape the narrative, they simply exist within it. Even the larger structure, the dictator, the hidden power behind him, adds layers but not enough depth. Because instead of building a complex or intimidating opposition, the film keeps things straightforward: clear targets, clear enemies, clear resolution. And while that simplicity fits the tone of the film, it limits the impact, because when the antagonists aren't strong enough, the victories don't feel as earned. In the end, The Expendables gives you opposition that works in the moment but doesn't linger in memory. They serve their purpose. They move the story forward. They provide resistance. But they never become the kind of presence that elevates the film. And in a movie built on larger-than-life heroes, that absence is impossible to ignore. Because sometimes, it's not the strength of the heroes that defines the story. It's the strength of what they're up against. There are two kinds of action movies: the ones that make you feel and the ones that make you react. The Expendables knows exactly which one it wants to be. On the surface, this is a film driven entirely by spectacle, explosions, high-intensity combat, relentless movement. It's built to overwhelm the senses, to keep you engaged through sheer intensity. But underneath all of that, there are moments where it almost reaches for something more. At the center is Sylvester Stallone as Barney Ross, a character who, at least briefly, isn't just defined by what he does, but by what he feels. There are hints of reflection, moments where the film slows down just enough to suggest something deeper: regret, conscience. The idea that these men who live mission to mission might be searching for something beyond it. You see it in the way Barney hesitates, in the way he considers the consequences of his decisions, in the quiet realization that maybe this isn't just another assignment. And for a moment, it feels like the film might explore that, but it never fully commits, because every time it gets close, every time it starts to build emotional weight, the spectacle takes over again. The explosions return, the action escalates, the pacing accelerates. And those quieter moments get left behind. It creates an interesting contrast. On one side, you have a film that clearly understands the idea of emotional depth. It sets up the pieces, it introduces the themes, it hints at internal conflict. But on the other side, you have a film that chooses not to stay there. Because The Expendables isn't trying to be introspective, it's not trying to challenge you emotionally, it's trying to engage you through energy. And in doing that, it prioritizes movement over meaning, impact over introspection. Even when emotional moments appear, like conversations that touch on regret or missed chances, they feel brief, almost like pauses rather than turning points. And that's the key difference. In films with real emotional depth, those moments shape the story. Here, they simply exist within it, and once they pass, the film moves on. So what you're left with is something that sits right in the middle, not completely empty, but not fully developed either. A film that shows you glimpses of something deeper, but never stays long enough to let it grow. And maybe that's intentional, because in a film built around spectacle, too much depth might slow it down, too much emotion might shift its identity. But at the same time, those glimpses remind you of what could have been. A version of this story that didn't just rely on explosive set pieces, but used them to support something more meaningful. Instead, The Expendables makes its choice clear. It gives you intensity, it gives you scale, it gives you constant motion, and leaves the emotional weight just beneath the surface. To really understand The Expendables, you have to look at where it comes from and what it's standing next to. Because this film doesn't exist in isolation, it exists between two worlds. On one side, the golden age of action cinema, the 80s, a time when action movies were simple but powerful. Clear heroes, clear villains, high stakes, and a style that didn't apologize for being bold, exaggerated, and larger than life. That's the DNA of The Expendables. You can feel it in every frame. The structure, the tone, the way the story moves from one confrontation to the next. This is the spirit of films like Commando and Rambo, not just referenced, but fully embraced. And at the center of that legacy is Sylvester Stallone, returning to the kind of filmmaking that defined his career. But here's the difference. Those classic films didn't just rely on action, they balanced it. There was tension, there was build-up. There were moments that made you care about what was happening, not just watch it. The Expendables doesn't always find that balance. Instead, it leans heavily into the surface elements. The explosions, the scale, the intensity. It captures the look of 80s action, but not always the feel. Now shift to the other side. Modern action films. Cleaner, more controlled, more precise. The action is designed to be followed. Every movement is clear. Every sequence is structured. And importantly, there's often a blend. Action mixed with humor. Intensity balanced with character. Some modern ensemble films understand this especially well. They know that action alone isn't enough. You need rhythm, personality, variation, and that's where The Expendables starts to fall behind. Because while it delivers scale, it doesn't always deliver contrast. It doesn't fully embrace humor. It doesn't consistently build tension. It doesn't evolve the formula it's inspired by. Instead, it stays in one lane. And that's both its identity and its limitation. Because depending on what you're looking for, that approach can feel either refreshing or outdated. If you grew up with 80s action films, this feels like coming home. If you're used to modern pacing, modern storytelling, it can feel like something is missing. And that's the space The Expendables lives in. Not fully modern, not fully classic. A film that recreates the past, but doesn't quite reach the level that made that past unforgettable. And that's the real comparison. It's not just about where the film comes from, it's about whether it captures what made those films truly work. And here, it comes close, but never quite gets all the way there. Here's the thing about The Expendables. It doesn't try to appeal to everyone, and it doesn't need to. Because from the very beginning, this film knows exactly who it's for. If you grew up watching action movies in the 80s, if you remember those larger-than-life heroes dominating the screen, if names like Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Bruce Willis mean something more than just actors, then this movie is already speaking your language. Because this isn't just entertainment, it's nostalgia. It's the feeling of going back to a time when action movies were simple, direct, and unapologetically bold. No overthinking, no over-explaining, just heroes, missions, and impact. And for that audience, it works. There's a certain kind of satisfaction in watching these icons share the screen, in seeing them do what they've always done, just now, together. Even if the story is thin, even if the execution isn't perfect, that feeling still lands. But then there's another side to this. Because outside of that nostalgic appeal, the film becomes something else. A guilty pleasure. The kind of movie you don't necessarily defend as great, but still enjoy watching. Because it gives you exactly what you expect. Explosions. High-stakes confrontations. One moment after another of pure, unfiltered action. And sometimes, that's enough. Even when the dialogue doesn't land, even when the pacing feels overwhelming, even when the story barely holds everything together, there's still something about it that keeps you engaged. Maybe it's the cast. Maybe it's the energy. Maybe it's just the sheer scale of what's happening on screen. But whatever it is, it works on a certain level. Of course, that doesn't mean everyone will connect with it. If you're looking for depth, if you're expecting strong character arcs or a tightly constructed narrative, this isn't that kind of film. And that's where the divide happens. Because for some viewers, The Expendables feels like a celebration. For others, it feels like missed potential. A film that had everything it needed to be great, but chose to stay comfortable instead. And yet, even with all its limitations, there's something undeniably watchable about it. Because sometimes, a movie doesn't need to be perfect. Sometimes, it just needs to be fun. And for the right audience. That's exactly what The Expendables delivers. Not a masterpiece, not a reinvention, just a loud, chaotic, nostalgia-fueled ride that knows exactly what it is and leans into it. There's a difference between a movie you enjoy once and a movie you keep coming back to. The Expendables, it lives right in between. The first time you watch it, there's a real sense of excitement, not because of the story, not because of the structure, but because of the moment. You're seeing Sylvester Stallone lead a team made up of faces you've watched for years. You're watching Jason Statham, Jet Li, Dolph Lundgren, all sharing the same space. And for that first viewing, that's enough. Because novelty carries the experience. But once that novelty fades, that's when the real question begins. What's left? And this is where The Expendables starts to struggle. Because beyond the cast, beyond the spectacle, there isn't much that pulls you back in. The story is straightforward. You already know how it plays out. The characters don't evolve in a way that reveals something new on repeat viewings. The action, while intense, doesn't always have the clarity or variation needed to stay engaging over time. So instead of becoming more interesting, it becomes more familiar. And familiarity, in this case, doesn't necessarily add value. That doesn't mean it's not rewatchable. There are still moments, specific scenes, specific interactions, specific bursts of action that hold up on their own. But as a complete experience, it doesn't deepen with time, it peaks early. Now, when you place it within the larger franchise, things become even more interesting. Because The Expendables isn't just a standalone film, it's the beginning of something, a concept that clearly had room to grow. Each sequel expands the idea, adds more faces, more scale, more variety. In many ways, the later entries feel like they're responding to this first film, adjusting the tone, expanding the humor, giving more space to the ensemble, which, in hindsight, makes the original feel like a starting point rather than a final product. A proof of concept. It establishes the formula, the team, the tone, the identity. But it doesn't fully realize the potential of what that formula could become, and that affects how it holds up over time. Because when you look back at it, you don't just see what it is, you see what it leads to. And sometimes, that makes it feel smaller than it did the first time. Still, there's value in that beginning. Because without this film, the idea doesn't exist, the franchise doesn't expand, the concept of bringing all these legends together doesn't evolve. So even if it doesn't grow stronger with repeat viewings, it remains important. Not because it's the best, not because it's the most refined, but because it started something. And sometimes, that's enough to make a film worth remembering, even if it's not one you return to again and again. So after everything, after the build-up, the action, the nostalgia, where does The Expendables actually land? Because this isn't a film that fails in a simple way. And it's not a film that fully succeeds either. It exists somewhere in the middle. Let's start with what it gets right. The concept alone is powerful. Bringing together icons of action cinema led by Sylvester Stallone isn't just appealing, it's exciting. And for large parts of the film, that excitement carries through. The cast has presence. The chemistry, especially with Jason Statham, keeps things engaging. There are moments of action that land with real impact. Moments of nostalgia that genuinely connect. Moments where you feel like you're watching something special just because of who's on screen. And when the film leans into that identity, it works. But then, the limitations start to surface. The story is thin. The dialogue rarely stands out. The pacing becomes overwhelming instead of exciting. And technically, the film doesn't always present its action in the clearest way. Even the things that should elevate it, the scale, the intensity, the non-stop momentum, sometimes work against it. Because more doesn't always mean better, and that's the central issue. The Expendables has everything it needs to be great, the cast, the concept, the legacy, but it never fully brings those elements together into something cohesive. Instead, it feels like a film that relies on its idea, more than it builds on it. You can see the potential in almost every aspect. Stronger writing could have elevated the characters. Better pacing could have made the action more impactful. More balance could have turned spectacle into something memorable. But those pieces never quite align, and so the film settles into something else. Not a masterpiece, not a failure. A solid, entertaining, but ultimately limited experience. For some viewers, that's enough. If you're here for nostalgia, for action, for the simple thrill of seeing legends share the screen, you'll find what you're looking for. But if you're expecting something deeper, something sharper, something that truly lives up to the scale of its own idea, you might walk away feeling like it just missed the mark. And that's what defines The Expendables. It delivers the moment, but not the legacy. It gives you the experience, but not the lasting impact. And in the end, it proves something important. Sometimes, even when everything looks perfect on paper, execution is what makes it unforgettable. And here, that's exactly where it falls just short.